and now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sabine O'Hara. So she currently leads the PhD program in urban leadership and entrepreneurship at the University of the District of Columbia, which interestingly is the only public university in Washington and the only exclusively urban land grant university in the United States. And I would just like to say that I think that Sabine's work is really contributing to that land grant vision of producing knowledge for the public good. She's the founding dean of CAUSES, which is the College of Agriculture, Urban Sustainability, and Environmental Sciences, where she helped develop the cutting-edge model for urban agriculture and urban sustainability that tries to integrate training with the practical aspirations of students to prepare a new generation of entrepreneurs in a green innovation economy. And it would take a long time to go over her past accomplishments, which are many. But a few. She was the 10th president of Roanoke College in Virginia. She was provost of Green Mountain College here in Vermont. She was a faculty member at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, I think the same time as John Erickson. And she was executive director for the Council of International Exchange of Scholars, which is the Fulbright Scholar Program, and the former president of the International Society of Ecological Economics. And she is going to present on rethinking agriculture toward a circular food economy. So thank you, Sabine, and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the two other speakers. This was awesome because both of you kind of set the table for me to, and you'll see there are a lot of links and a lot of recurring themes here. But I would be remiss as an ecological economist if I didn't also fill in a little bit of the theory and trying to connect theory and practical applications. So thank you for this opportunity, Josh. It's great to be here and to talk to you about my favorite topic, namely not just food. And I'm a foodie, apart from being an ag economist by training. But I really think we are onto something with these much more circular models of the economy that are much more attempting to pattern economic processes after how nature works. And so I want to start there, what it means to be rethinking agriculture. If you think about it as what could agriculture look like if it were more circular, more patterned after how nature worked? Well, it certainly would have to be a whole lot more decentralized than what we have now. And we certainly have a combination. You heard about the the models out in California, and we see the same thing on the East Coast. There are these islands, I want to say, of decentralized small-scale agriculture in the midst of a very centralized monoculture-oriented system, but the bulk of it is very centralized, and that has food security implications. We just heard Jason mention that at the end, right? Because if you have a very centralized food system where then you are consistently dependent on distribution and processing, storage, all that kind of thing, it makes it very difficult to provide consistent access to high quality food, food that hasn't suffered in nutrient density from long storage, long travel times, and so forth. Our food system would need to become a whole lot more resilient because these large-scale monoculture systems are very vulnerable. Hopefully we'll be able to rethink agriculture in a way that it can strengthen ecosystem services, because there's really nothing that connects us to nature like our food and food production. And so it's a perfect place to start thinking about how do these ecosystem services work? And if you work in the soil in agriculture, you know, what better place to start thinking about, is it possible to re-sequester carbon? How can we improve water filtration and all those kinds of things that are really important to recover and rethink. But food is also very much an expression of our cultures, our diversity as human communities. And so it has that potential as well of strengthening communities. and health and wellness, both at a personal individual level, but also at a community level, because there is nothing that connects us to nature like our food and our food system. So this is really where we need to completely rethink how we do not just agriculture, but I like to think about agriculture as the exemplar for rethinking our economic system. And so in this traditional economic view, we treat people as inputs and we treat nature as inputs. And as we all know, the economy is this transformation system where these inputs are turned into useful goods and services, and oops, there are emissions and there is waste. And a lot of times we haven't really thought about these things in any kind of systems way to say, well, is there a way to avoid these externalities in the first place? And if we create them, how can we mitigate them? So this is more, you might say, a bit of a more enlightened way of thinking about economic activity and its impact on society and culture and on the environment. And we've called that all kinds of different names, but I think the current version is the 3 Ps, the profit, people, and planet impact. And so long-term sustainability and resilient systems, you might say, is at this overlapping center here of the Venn diagram, where we somehow meet economic as well as social and environmental objectives. And of course, as ecological economists, we know better, because this is much closer to the truth, because the economy, after all, is a human-made system. It wasn't just handed to us like a natural law of gravity or something, but we made it up. We came up with the principles, the assessments, the evaluation systems that we have and the ways we think about our economy. And so we have the opportunity to change it. And a beginning place for this change is to recognize that it is a human-made system, and it is nested within society and culture, and it is nested within the environment. And so recovering that understanding that it's that little bitty thing that has nothing to do with natural laws, but maybe should take its lead a little bit more from natural laws and from how nature works, maybe that's a good starting point. And since we have diverse cultures, and unfortunately we're losing that diversity too, just like we're losing biodiversity, we're losing the diversity of cultural arrangements to this predominant market model. And so I think it would behoove us, while we're recovering our knowledge of context, that we also pay attention to different cultural models that maybe give us different pointers in how we can live better within a social cultural context and an environmental context. So you might think this is how we've always defined increasing productivity. And it's a little bitty piece of the picture. Maybe 10% if you think of all the ecosystem services that are around us. Jason mentioned the energy impacts, right? So here's maybe what we've done over the last, 30 years or so. We've discovered that, oh, there are these emissions and waste that are really creating these bothersome negative externalities. So if you look at outputs here, and as your input use increases on your horizontal axis, so does your output, but it increases in decreasing scales. And so underneath that curve, again, if you think as input use along your horizontal axis, you now have emissions, and emissions unfortunately have a different habit than this productivity. They don't typically get lower as input use increases, but in fact, they get higher. And so we have increasing rates of emissions and often get into these runaway curves. And so the added perspective in innovation has been, okay, let's see if we can actually lower these emission functions and put them down a bit, right? So that we increase technology in a way that would reduce the impact of the emissions and waste. And that's a different way of innovation. The forefront of innovation now needs to be this. And we know very little about it. And what that is, I call that the sink capacities. Namely, every economic process is not only about the sources, but it's also about the sinks. How do we process that stuff as we get emissions, as we have waste, as we have stress on human communities? Where do these systems recover? Well, nature has provided many of these recovery systems for us, and in human communities, I dare say it's still women who provide a lot of these recovery systems in the human communities. And if we needed a lesson in that, just look at the number of women who are leaving the workforce and have left the workforce in COVID, because something has to give. If you are in the workforce, homeschooling, taking care of the kids and the families and so forth. So these what I call sink capacities, are these kinds of things that we do to help systems recover, to nurture them back to health, to ensure that their capacity persists into the future. And so this is where the real innovation needs to lie. How do we make sure that these absorptive capacities, these buffer capacities, these capacities to deal with the stressors, both on the environment and on our human communities, that these capacities are preserved and strengthened? So that's what I mean by a circular economy that looks at output then as a function of all three of these: productivity increases, lowering emissions, and strengthening sink capacities. So let me shift now to the practical application of what we've done with this concept in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a context. Washington, D.C. administratively is divided into 8 wards. And some of these wards are west of the Anacostia River and north. And those are your high income wards. Look at Ward 3. These are household incomes. Ward 2 is where Georgetown is. So as opposed to what we call east of the river, and that is Ward 7 and 8. As you can see here, look at the percentages of non-Hispanic Black populations in Ward 7 and 8 versus Ward 2 and 3. And you see that a lot of disparities also reflect race and race disparities, unemployment numbers. And this was pre-COVID, okay? We had 3.7 and 3.8% unemployment in Ward 2 and 3, and we had double-digit unemployment in Ward 7 and 8. And things haven't gotten any better. I'm also always very concerned about the single-family, single-parent households headed by females, and very high percentages. In fact, Ward 7 is the youngest ward in the district with the highest number of school-aged children. And this is how these disparities then play out. The yellow bars are obesity of adult populations, and the red bars are diabetes of adult population. And look at the low diabetes and obesity rates here versus in Ward 7 and 8. And these are now underlying health conditions, preconditions that also translate during the pandemic in exorbitantly high rates of infections and fatalities in those communities that wrestle with these health disparities as a result of the social determinants of these health factors. So that's the context within which we work and live. And many of you, when you visit the nation's capital, you don't see the neighborhoods east of the river. So here's another interesting thing. And again, we've already touched on it with the 2 previous speakers. But as the pandemic has occurred, in some ways, as much as we became aware of the need for shorter food chains, shorter supply chains, a more resilient food system, we also did some of the opposite. Namely, we relied more and more on home delivery services, at least those of us who can afford home delivery services. And so, yes, we recovered some of the home gardening and directly growing your own food for your own plate. And you see that in the rise of community gardens and just the interest in gardening and food production during the pandemic. It's been pretty phenomenal how many people are all of a sudden interested in starting some of that and at least learning how to grow some of their own food. And that's a really, really important trend. Even in cities, people want to learn more about how to grow some of their own food. And yet, in reality, as we've added these home delivery services to some extent out of necessity, right, we've added to the supply chains. Because now you don't just go from the packaging and distribution center to the store, but now you go from distribution to another packaging sector to the delivery, which again has carbon and then to the plate. So we've just added to the supply chain. And we've added to the supply chain by through the use of the virtual economy, which is of course growing in leaps and bounds because everything is ordered online and we want it overnight. And so these expectations have consequences because there is no such thing as a virtual economy, really, right? I mean, the virtual economy is still embedded in a real life social and cultural context and in a real physical environmental context. And so we've also been confronted with the implications of that, because as we expect home deliveries of our food right to our doorstep, we have a new term, namely the essential workforce. It's the essential workforce that is expected to do that. And they are working in distribution centers shoulder to shoulder and carry the highest risk of the infections during the pandemic. And they're also some of the lowest paid. So we have a lot of things to rethink that we have recently been confronted with in terms of our food system. But again, think of food as an exemplar of how do we need to rethink the economy in many, many different sectors, not just food. So here's what we've done and what we've come up with as a potential solution, and there need to be many solutions. And these solutions, I think at their best, need to be cognizant of the social and cultural context and the physical environmental context within which they are offered. And so we came up with a solution that we call our urban food hubs. Each food hub has 4 components, but these 4 components can look very different depending on where the food hubs are located. So these are a circular system, a circular model. We produce the food, then we prepare the food, we distribute the food, and we close the loop through waste and water recovery. And we try to do that at the design stage, not as an afterthought. So this is a circular model at the outset. And we then ask the question, what can it look like in different neighborhoods of Washington, D.C.? So production can happen in soil, but it also happens in hydroponic and aquaponic systems because soil pollution is sometimes a real problem. Sometimes you can mitigate it in the urban context by throwing a foot of compost and, you know, getting to soil quality levels that are safe for food production, but sometimes it's just not doable and you have to produce in soilless systems, ideally in recirculating systems. So one is aquaponics that we use a lot. Fish is raised in fish tanks. The fish poop becomes the fertilizer for the plants. As the water circulates through, the plants take up the nutrients and then the water recirculates back into the fish tank. You need to insert oxygen along the way. For those of you who are interested in the technicalities, that will be a whole other conversation sometime. But we also produce food, as you can see here in this picture, on roofs. So we have a 20,000 square foot food producing green roof on one of our campuses where we demonstrate food production in the urban scape. And then comes the second component of the urban food hub, namely food preparation. This means cooking and reintroducing people to seasonal diets. And this was a lesson we learned early on in some of our markets or food stands when we took food into some of the neighborhoods that have very limited access to unprocessed fresh food. And we learned very quickly that we needed recipe sheets and that we needed food demonstrations to recover the art of preparing food, preferably seasonally. But then it also comes to the food conservation, right? Unfortunately, the zucchini is always all ripe at the same time. And so then what do you do with it? You need to pickle, you need to can, you need to find ways of preserving the food for the off season when your productivity levels will be much lower. That then links into the third component, namely food distribution system. Certainly farmers markets are a way to do that. We've heard about that already. DC happens to have the highest number of farmers market per capita in the United States. And that's just sort of evolved over the last 10 years or so. There are CSA, but then there are also for the growers, for these small growers, there are direct marketing contracts. A niche for small growers here are what the USDA calls ethnic crops. So these are crops that are not native to the Americas, but they can fetch very high revenue when you directly market them to ethnic restaurants. And so some of our market research has shown very high receptivity to West African crops because we have immigrant populations from that part of the world, but also Central American. And we're producing some of the hottest peppers in town, a Congo Ghost, for example. So for those ethnic groups that really want their food spicy. So these different distribution models are, again, a very fertile ground to rethink how we do things and to see how we can make different connections to then market these products either in their raw and unprocessed state or in their processed state. One that I thought might be of interest to you, we have a program here in DC that's called Veggie Prescriptions, where some of the collaborating health providers, instead of prescribing medications, are prescribing coupons to the farmers market. So people can be encouraged to change their diets. And instead of being more and more dependent on the pharmaceuticals, let's recover some of the physical health through unprocessed fresh food that is in season. And then the fourth component is a big bucket of activities, anything from rainwater collection to recirculating water systems to drip irrigation to save on evaporation in the irrigation process to composting, improving soil health, using food waste for energy generation through biodigesters. So this fourth component of closing the loop through waste and water management is a very large list of activities. And again, depending on the context in which we built these food hubs, they look different from location to location. So what you see here is a map of Washington, D.C., and I mentioned the 8 wards. So this is the Ward 3 with the highest household income. This is Ward 2. And these two here are east of what we call east and south of the river, the Ward 7 and 8 wards. And look at the number of grocery stores. The purple dots are full service grocery stores where people have access to unprocessed food. And in fact, this one has since disappeared. So now you have roughly 150,000 people per 2 grocery stores, as opposed to the density here. And so this is where we've been building some of these food hubs. Those are those green squares. And you see, we've tried to deliberately locate them in some of those areas where food access is very limited. So this is one of our locations in Ward 5. This is actually a neighborhood in transition, and we have 3 greenhouses there, a hydroponic system, an aquaponic system. And here's another interesting link, namely, we also have a native plant nursery where we produce native plant seedlings for parks and recreation to try and push out the invasive species out of DC parks. This is our location in Ward 7, definitely so-called food applied areas. I prefer that term because I don't want to have people think negatively of desert environments. Desert environments can be very beautiful and very positive. So I prefer the term food apartheid neighborhoods to talk about what these are, these neighborhoods that have deliberately kept food access at a limit. And each of these locations also has a community garden. Here you see work in the community garden, and then some food stands to provide access to the produce. This is another one in way southeast in Ward 8, where we have a hydroponic and aquaponic system. And that has now been turned over to a person who has been trained through our programs and who is running these as a leasee. And in our main campus in Ward 3, definitely not a food apartheid neighborhood, but we have some demonstration systems and teach all the different things I've just talked about. So who are our farmers?
I was getting a little bit engrossed in your presentation. I lost track of the time, but if you only have a couple of minutes to wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm just wrapping up, Josh. So there are businesses, nonprofits, and gardeners who are interested in growing food. We have new farmers, but also immigrant farmers who are very experienced. Virtually all of them are landless, and land is very expensive in Washington, D.C. So we are not the same model as you might say Detroit or Buffalo, where land is, abundantly available because the bottom has fallen out of the local economy. In fact, we compete against development pressures. Most of these farmers are under-resourced, except for some moving in that are from high-end, corporate environment type aquaponic and hydroponic systems. But we really try to make an effort to grow these farms locally rather than simply having people move in. And yes, we are in need of much more cooperative and collaborative models, really are bumping up against the limits of this idea of neoliberal private enterprise ownership where everybody can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's not so. There is a history of cooperatives in DC. There was a DC grocery cooperative, believe it or not, that was really flourishing for the better part of 50 years and supported over 300 small enterprises, just like the one you just mentioned, Josh, with food cars and so forth in ethnic neighborhoods. We need an urban commons, an understanding of shared land to improve land access and to support collaborative models. We need stronger collaboration between rural, peri-urban, and urban producers to figure out what do we do where. And I think it makes the most sense to produce the most highly perishable food that really suffers in nutrient density as it gets transported and stored over long periods of time, to produce that in the urban core and then move out in concentric circles, because there is plenty left for the rural space, because nobody in their right mind, given what land prices are in DC, would produce corn or soybeans or even a lot of root vegetables in a place like Washington, D.C. So we need innovative policies, including policies that recognize that we need to compensate for positive social and environmental contributions that a re-envisioned food system can make, and that has benefits for society, both in terms of social and environmental implications. And then we have to pay for it, and we have to have the political will to rethink how this compensation model works. So with that, I'll share some images from our urban farms with you. And maybe we can travel again sometime later this year or into next year. You're always welcome to have a tour of the Washington, D.C. you've probably never seen.
Well, thank you very much, Sabine.